Well, I think most of us think of superannuation as that pot of money for when we retire, but it's not actually the case in terms of legislation. The Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, has spoken of doing so today to properly define what superannuation is for. It's in large part a response to the government allowing Australians to withdraw super without any reason given during COVID. Joining me live is Rachel Clun, economics correspondent, I should say, with the Sydney Morning Herald. Thanks for your time. So the point here is around making what we think of super legislated, but it hasn't always been that simple. When there was a push previously to make sure super could give a dignified retirement or a comfortable one, people said, well, hang on, how do you define that? That's subjective. So is it a simple change that could be made?
It's interesting how much a few words can really cause a bit of tension, I think, between the industry, government, opposition, all of those different parties. You know, it's one sentence, but I think there'll be a lot of fight over what dignified means, for instance. Stuart Robert, the opposition finance services spokesman, has come out about that. But the government's real focus is on preserving savings. That's kind of their core focus here, preserving it for retirement income. They don't want it essentially to be taken out early for things like housing or, as we saw during the pandemic.
Yeah, so define it, legislate for it, and if a future government wants to change it, it's on them to have to make that change. The interesting thing about COVID during the pandemic is advocates to say, let's get access to your super, say, look, 3 million people accessed it and spent, what was it, I think $36 million or so.
36 billion, I think. 36
billion, sorry. 36 million would be nothing. So 36 billion. But on the flip side, it wasn't used, we don't quite know exactly what it was used for, but all the sort of surveys suggest there was a fair bit wasted. So what do we take out of the COVID experiment on super?
Look, that was really interesting. There was also some suggestion that a lot of women were coerced into withdrawing super by abusive partners. So, you know, we saw used car market, you know, the prices for used cars go up. We saw house prices go up. So some people did use it to pay off things like their credit card debt, which, you know, I don't think we can argue is a bad use of it. But I'm sure some people certainly just spent it on some extra things. And it is a lot of money, $36 billion.
Yeah, given it was this open slather, I feel like it's not the best advertisement for advocates to access super because you could use it for whatever. If you want to use it for housing, for example, and the plan from the Morrison government, remember, which they took to an election which hasn't got up, was for first home buyers, you know, targeted towards first home buyers. You couldn't earn above a certain amount, and the house value was limited as well. What's the argument for that sort of role for super, and the argument against, I guess?
Yeah, so we saw with that policy that they were really trying to kind of restrict it to a certain number of people and also a certain amount of money. So I think people could withdraw up to 40% of their super balance or $50,000, whichever was greater. I guess one of the arguments against something like that, which really drives demand, and we have a big shortage of housing supply in Australia. So anything that adds...
that's coming in particular, right? That's about to be exacerbated.
Exactly. And anything that drives demand is just going to drive up house prices. So that's not necessarily going to help people who need assistance to get into the housing market.
The micro for this, I'd argue, if there's an individual out there that has, say, 150 grand in their super and they're 40 years old and they want to get their first home, it makes sense. They'll be in a better position if they get the first home before retirement. But the macro is if everybody's in that situation, then you get the demand issue. Exactly,
and that person who is 40 years old might just end up paying $50,000 extra for that property than they would have otherwise because everyone else is accessing it.
Because they're funneled towards that type of property too, right?
Exactly.
It's a first home buyer, it's a certain value, it's probably in a certain part of the city they're looking for.
Exactly.
All right, so the other interesting part about this is that what we're reading between the lines here on tax, because it had to be equitable and sustainable, and that leads people to think, right, what are they planning? What would the government be looking at here, perhaps the low-hanging fruit, because the amount of returns you get on your super tax-free is up to about 1.8 million, I think. Is that where they might be looking, or is it a tax rate above that? What's the most likely action?
Well, look, there are about 11,000 superannuation accounts that have more than $5 million in it. And I think it's pretty fair to argue that $5 million is more than most people would need as a retirement income.
Yeah.
So, you know, if they just capped it at $5 million, I think the analysis is that they would save $1.4 billion in those tax concessions, which is not a small amount of money.
It's a decent start. I think that's almost, we assume they're going to do that. It's sort of how much further? Is that Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You know, the Treasurer mentioned in his speech this morning that those concessions are in their sights ahead of the budget. He mentioned that the tax concessions, which cost about $53 billion, or expected to cost $53 billion this financial year, are just below the cost of the age pension in total, which is over 55. That's a huge chunk of money. So I think they'll be really looking at what they can save and then maybe spend some more money on other things that they need.
And what would be politically palatable, because once you start talking about this, it gets into a big stoush. Rachel, thank you.
Thank you.